So today we're finishing up our week in Isaiah chapter 27, which is the last verse or last chapter in this section that we call Isaiah's a little apocalypse. It talks about the victory of the Lord and his dealings with the faithful in the last days. Notice in chapter 27, verse 1, verse 2, and verse 12, they begin with "in that day." This again is a signal that we're looking to the day of the Lord, that Isaiah is looking ahead to an eschatological day of the Lord. Several sections in this chapter. Verse 1 talks about the destruction of the Lord's enemies. Verses 2 through 6 talk about the faithful remnant is preserved. 7 through 11, how the faithful remnant will be purified. And 12 through 13, how the faithful remnant will be restored in that day. Chapter opens with an interesting first verse that deserves probably a long commentary of its own, but we'll rush by it today for the sake of just getting an overview of what's happening here. It says, "In that day the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea." So this idea of Leviathan and the dragon or the monster, these are allusions to Babylonian creation stories. Some believe that Isaiah is using those stories to communicate God's victory over idolatry, God's victory over gods that are really not gods at all. Seems to be what's going on here. Look how the kind of a triplet of descriptions here. God's sword is hard, great, and strong. I think ultimately when we look ahead and see the coming destruction in the last days, God uses his word. It's the sword of the Spirit, the sword that comes out of Jesus' mouth, and it's described here as hard and great and strong. And that threefold sword is brought against a threefold enemy: a Leviathan that's fleeing, one that's twisting, and a dragon that is in the sea, or a monster. Back in Genesis chapter 1, when God created the heavens and the earth, he created the creatures of the sea. So these creatures that are part of a Babylonian creation story, they play central role in that story, but in God's story, in Isaiah's prophecy here, these are merely creatures that exist at God's pleasure and are destroyed at his word. We also see how throughout the Bible, the creation story is echoed and balanced by what happens in the last days. Several have commented on how the opening chapters of Genesis find their completion in the closing chapters of Revelation. And even Jesus himself said that the last days will be like the days during the time of Noah, when people were eating and drinking. And the end will come unexpectedly. So even Jesus makes a comparison between the beginning and the end. And that's what we see here. Verses 2 through 6, we see the faithful remnant preserved. Again, Isaiah is using picturesque imagery here, metaphors again. Vineyard is often used to describe Israel. And here we see a vineyard, a pleasant vineyard, a vineyard that God keeps night and day at the end of verse 3. "I have no wrath. Would that I had thorns and briars to battle. I would march against them. I would burn them up together." So God threatens to do this, but in fact there are none, because the vineyard, which is his faithful people in Israel, have been preserved. Verses 7 to 11, then we see the faithful purified. He has struck them as he struck those who struck, has he struck them as he struck those who struck them? Or have they been slain as their slayers were slain? Measure by measure, By exile you contended with them. He removed them with his fierce breath in the day of the east wind. So what he's talking about here is, has he destroyed his people as the same way he has destroyed his enemies? Well, no, he has sent them into exile. He has blown them away from Israel like an east wind would blow away chaff, but he is going to restore them. It says, therefore, by this the guilt of Jacob will be atoned for, and this will be the fruit, the full fruit of the removal of his sin, when he makes all the stones of the altars like chalk stones, crushed to pieces. No Asherim nor incense altars will remain standing. What is the evidence that God has chastised his people successfully? They turn away from idolatry. They turn away from worshiping foreign gods. They turn away from the Asherim and the altars that they have set up. But look how this section closes in verses 10 through 11. The fortified cities is solitary, a habitation deserted and forsaken like the wilderness. There the calf grazes. There it lies down and strips his branches. This is a desolation that's come. When its boughs are dry, they are broken. Women come and make a fire of them, for this is a people without discernment. Therefore he who made them will not have compassion on them. He who formed them will show them no favor. This is an echo from Isaiah 6, where God commissioned Isaiah to go to a people who would not listen. And that's what's being echoed here, that God is going to purify them. God is going to cleanse them of idolatry. He's going to cure them of idolatry by his exile of them. But they will be hard of learning. Their heads are hard, their necks are stiff. They will return to it. Verse 12. In that day, from the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt, the Lord will thresh out the grain, and you will be gleaned one by one, O people of Israel. Talking here about the final restoration that's coming. Yes, they'll be at exile. Yes, the people will be hard of learning, but ultimately God will return them to the land that he promised them, and he will thresh them out. That is, he will separate the wheat from the chaff, even among his people, and the chaff will be blown away. And in that day a great trumpet will be blown, and those who were lost in the land of Assyria and those who were driven out of the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem. Again, we've seen this in some small ways in Israel's history, but Isaiah is looking forward here to that day, that great eschatological day that's still coming, that final restoration of his people. So closes Isaiah's little apocalypse. And so, brothers and sisters, we can look forward to that day where God will restore his people, that he will establish his kingdom, that he will punish the nations finally and completely, and purge from the earth all idolatry. Won't that be a glorious day? God bless you, brothers and sisters. Have a great weekend. Spend some time reflecting on these chapters in Isaiah this week and see if you can come up with personal applications for these chapters in your own life. God bless you.